The HOA had always pushed boundaries, but the night their so-called security officer pointed a gun at my son, everything changed. They assumed he was just another teenager to intimidate, never realizing he was an FBI tactical commander. What followed exposed every secret this HOA tried to bury. The neighborhood had always presented itself as a peaceful, manicured community where nothing ever truly went wrong. Perfect lawns, identical mailboxes, trimmed hedges, and the constant hum of quiet conformity. It was the kind of place where problems stayed hidden beneath clean sidewalks, where the HOA had woven themselves into every rule, every corner, every family's routine. It was a place that believed it was safe simply because it looked safe. And for years that illusion held, until the day my son came home shaking, pale, and on the verge of collapse. For the longest time, our family had navigated the constant HOA restrictions without complaint. We paid the fees, followed the rules, and ignored the passive-aggressive letters. My son, Ethan, rarely interacted with anyone in the neighborhood. Work kept him away for long stretches, and even when he was home, he kept to himself. No one ever knew what he really did for a living. The only thing the HOA ever saw was a quiet, disciplined man who spent his leave fixing things around the house, training in the morning, and keeping to a strict schedule. They thought he was a rigid, private young man, just another veteran trying to readjust. They had no idea they were dealing with a federal tactical commander, and they never would have needed to know. If their so-called security force hadn't crossed a line no neighborhood association ever should. In the early afternoon sunlight of a calm Thursday, the neighborhood looked harmless. Children rode bikes on the sidewalks, sprinklers misted front lawns, and the dull hum of suburban monotony filled the air. Yet beneath that peaceful exterior, tensions had been quietly brewing. The HOA board had recently hired a private security contractor, a man who liked to parade around the neighborhood in a black tactical vest, mirrored sunglasses, and a badge he had bought online. He treated the neighborhood like a military base, barking orders at residents, threatening fines, and blocking off areas he had no authority to control. Residents had complained, but the HOA dismissed every concern with the same justification, that security is essential, and the neighborhood must maintain order. And so the man roamed freely, growing bolder each day. He monitored driveways, inspected porches, and inserted himself into arguments. His obsession with control grew with every hour he spent pretending he held real power. But no one expected him to turn a gun on someone, and least of all on someone like my son. That morning, Ethan had stepped outside only to retrieve a package near the edge of the driveway. It was a simple, uneventful action, something that shouldn't have drawn attention from anyone, let alone a supposed security guard. But the man had been lingering nearby, scanning the street, hungry for confrontation. Something about Ethan, maybe his quiet discipline, maybe the way he observed everything without reacting, triggered the guard's fragile ego. The confrontation happened fast, escalating with a level of aggression wildly disproportionate to the situation. The guard's hand drifted toward the weapon on his hip, a firearm he had no legal reason to carry on HOA property. And then, in a moment of unhinged impulse, he drew it, aiming at Ethan, threatening him, asserting dominance he never truly had. Neighbors witnessed everything, frozen with fear, terrified of intervening. Children were pulled inside homes. Curtains shifted. Silence took over the street like a thick fog. But what the guard didn't know, what no one in that neighborhood had ever known, was that Ethan spent his life confronting real threats. He had stared down trained militants, traffickers, extremists, and killers. He had survived situations far more dangerous than a wannabe with a gun. He had spent years commanding tactical agents capable of neutralizing crises the world never heard about. And he had returned home only days earlier from a federal operation that would never be spoken of publicly. Yet despite his training, his instincts, and his experience, he froze. Not because he was scared of the weapon, but because he realized that if he reacted the way he was trained to react, the neighborhood would never be the same again. And so he remained perfectly still, waiting, calculating, choosing restraint over retaliation. And eventually, the guard lowered his weapon and stormed off, believing he had won the encounter. Except he had lost something far greater, the last shred of authority he ever thought he had. When Ethan walked into the house afterward, he was still controlled, still composed, but his hands trembled. Not from fear, but from the effort of holding back every instinct he'd spent years sharpening. The federal agent in him was restrained, but the anger simmered like boiling metal beneath the surface. That's when he told me what had happened. And that's when the illusion of our peaceful neighborhood shattered. The HOA had crossed a line that could not be ignored. Their fake security guard had threatened the wrong person. And they had no idea how grave their mistake truly was. Because in the hours that followed, Ethan made a single call. One that would send shockwaves through every level of the HOA, their hired guard, and the small web of power they thought they held. A call that would begin the unraveling of their control, their arrogance, and their false authority. What began as a routine day in a quiet neighborhood was now the beginning of an extraordinary war. One between a delusional HOA and a man who spent his life dismantling threats far more dangerous than they could ever comprehend. And as the sun set that evening, the neighborhood had no idea that everything was about to change forever. The news of the confrontation spread through the neighborhood before the sun had even begun to rise. It traveled in whispered messages, hurried HOA group chats, and frantic phone calls between board members who now realized the gravity of what had happened the previous night. Yet none of them truly grasped the severity. To them, the HOA's security force was some self-appointed authority, a group of overconfident volunteers who acted as if their community patrol badges granted them law enforcement powers. They enjoyed the illusion of control, and for years no one had challenged them. But that illusion shattered the moment they pointed a gun at the wrong person. While my son spent the rest of the night gathering evidence, the neighborhood remained wrapped in a tense silence. The fake security guard who had confronted him, Henry Maddox, spent the night pacing in front of the HOA office, continuously checking the footage on his body camera and attempting to craft a story that would paint him as the hero and my son as a threat. He rehearsed excuses, justifications, and fabricated claims of suspicious behavior. He was afraid but far too arrogant to admit it. Across the cul-de-sac, the board president, Sharon Weldon, woke before dawn to a flurry of panicked messages. She had always been the type to maintain superiority through force, intimidation, and strict rules. For years she'd kept the residents under her thumb, using fines and threats of liens to silence anyone who questioned her leadership. Under her control, the HOA's security team acted like her personal enforcers. Her pride was built on the belief that she was untouchable. That belief would soon be disproven. While the HOA scrambled to invent a narrative that protected themselves, my son prepared his own report, except his was grounded in evidence, law, and tactical precision. Before dawn, he had already compiled everything. The gun brandished illegally, the threatening posture, the lack of certification, even the violation of multiple federal imposter statutes. He didn't just view the incident as a personal offense. It was a federal crime unfolding in a residential community. But he also understood something deeper. The HOA had grown reckless over time. Their fabricated authority had turned into a culture of intimidation. Henry wasn't just acting on his own. He was the product of their leadership, their ego, their abuse of power. And if one man was willing to pull a firearm on an unarmed resident's son, others might feel emboldened to do the same. As the morning light stretched over the houses, residents began stepping onto driveways, unaware of the storm building just beyond their picket fences. Something felt different, an unusual tension, a thick quietness that made dogs bark and curtains shift. Word spread that someone from law enforcement had been involved in a late-night incident, though no one knew the details yet. Some believed the HOA's whispers, that the board was dealing with a dangerous intruder. Others suspected the truth, that the HOA had finally crossed the line they'd been tiptoeing toward for years. By mid-morning, the HOA called an emergency meeting inside their small office building near the community pool. Board members gathered around a long table cluttered with binders, rulebooks, and paperwork. Sharon presided at the head of the table, her posture stiff, her expression tight. Henry stood to one side, his face pale, hands trembling. The conversation quickly spiraled into panic. Their biggest fear wasn't the danger they had caused. It was the potential consequences. Lawsuits, investigations, loss of authority. The narrative they crafted was desperate and flimsy. Henry claimed he felt threatened, insisted the neighborhood had been experiencing suspicious activity, and repeated the lines Sharon prepared for him. But even as they attempted to convince each other they were safe, the truth overshadowed them. Henry knew what he saw in my son's eyes that night. Not fear, not aggression, calm authority. A level of control that only someone trained for high-risk federal operations could possess. The HOA didn't just target an ordinary resident. They targeted someone who operated far above their imagined chain of command. Meanwhile, my son remained composed. He didn't rush. He didn't threaten. He followed procedure, not the kind learned in private security manuals, but federal protocols rooted in law and jurisdiction. He contacted his unit, filed the incident, and prepared the documentation required for escalation. But before taking any official action, he came home to speak privately with me. Wordlessly, he shared the footage. Watching a stranger level a weapon at my child, even an adult child with elite training, sent a chill through me that I had never experienced before. Fear mixed with anger, then transformed into something sharper. Resolve. This was no longer about fines, power games, or petty HOA control. This was about safety. This was about a system that had grown so corrupted by ego that it believed it could police residents with weapons and threats. The HOA had created a culture of unchecked authority, and for the first time, they were about to face someone who wouldn't be intimidated. By late afternoon, residents began murmuring about a convoy of government vehicles seen entering the outer road leading toward the community. No sirens, no lights, just quiet, deliberate arrival. Their presence sent ripples through the neighborhood, prompting residents to peek through blinds and stand frozen on porches. Inside the HOA office, Sharon continued insisting they could handle the situation internally, unaware of how far the consequences had already climbed above her. She believed the worst that could happen was a stern warning or a reprimand. She still saw herself as the authority. But the balance of power had already shifted. The moment Henry touched his weapon, everything changed. He hadn't pointed it at a criminal. He hadn't defended the community. He'd committed an armed threat against a federal tactical commander. And in doing so, he triggered a chain of events none of them were prepared for. As the sun dipped behind the houses, long shadows stretched across the community streets. Vehicles rolled quietly toward the HOA office. A presence, calm, controlled, and unmistakably official, filled the air. Inside the office, the board members finally realized that their reign of intimidation had come to an abrupt end. They were no longer the ones in control. And as the doorknob turned and the room fell silent, a new chapter began, one in which the HOA would face accountability they never believed possible. The neighborhood felt different the next morning, quieter, heavier, as if the very air had absorbed the tension of the previous day. The HOA might have hoped the situation would fade overnight, that the fear they attempted to impose would settle into the soil and keep everyone obedient. But something else was forming instead. A rising awareness that the community had crossed a line, and the consequences of that line would come back with force. The sun came up slowly, spilling across the identical streets, reflecting off manicured lawns and freshly washed driveways. But the neighborhood's quiet perfection did nothing to cover the unease. Curtains fluttered as homeowners peeked outside, whispering to themselves, wondering if anyone else would speak up, wondering if the HOA had finally gone too far. Most of them didn't yet know what had happened to the boy near the guardhouse, but they sensed something was wrong. Something big. Across the city, long before anyone in the neighborhood stirred, a different kind of morning routine was unfolding. In a secure federal training facility miles away, the rhythmic thud of boots echoed across the concrete as tactical teams began their drills. The sun illuminated the gravel lot outside the hangar, casting long shadows behind the armored trucks and specialized vehicles parked neatly in rows. Among the disciplined movement of seasoned operatives, one presence stood out, not because of his rank, but because the entire environment seemed to shift around him. The FBI tactical commander moved with a quiet steadiness, the kind that came from years of leading high-risk operations, of walking directly into situations normal people would run from. His judgment had been shaped by crisis, sharpened through missions that required absolute precision. He was respected not for his authority, but because he embodied calm under pressure. And that calm shattered the moment his phone vibrated. In the early hours, he received a message, brief, urgent, trembling beneath the typed words. A recording followed, and then a still image. His son on the ground, frightened, staring into the barrel of a gun held by a man who had no business carrying one. Something inside him shifted. Not anger, not fear, but a cold, strategic clarity. His son had been threatened. His family had been targeted. And the man responsible had done so believing he was above consequence. The tactical commander ended his morning operations without hesitation. The quiet respect of his team echoed behind him as he walked with purpose through the facility. No one questioned him. They didn't need to. They recognized the expression, one that meant a storm was gathering, but not a reckless one. He didn't move with rage. He moved with intent. Back in the neighborhood, the HOA security guard tried to pretend it was a normal day. He stood in the guard booth, pacing from one end to another with restless steps. Every sound made him flinch. Every car that slowed near the gate made his breath catch. The HOA board had told him to lie low, to say nothing, to keep quiet until they figured out their options. But the guard already knew he was alone. The board that encouraged him to be aggressive, to act like the enforcer of their little kingdom, would not protect him when consequences came. They would deny him, distance themselves, and leave him exposed. Inside the neighborhood, rumors swirled quietly. A few neighbors had seen the boy's shaken state the night before. A few had seen the confrontation. Some heard the story in fragments. Gun, kid, security, illegal. But fear kept their voices low. People who lived under HOA rule understood that speaking out came with costs. And a board willing to arm security proved they were comfortable pushing boundaries. By afternoon, cars moved slowly through the community, tension thick enough to taste. The HOA board members gathered in one of their homes, scrambling to craft a version of events they believed might protect them. They debated policy language, security protocols, and excuses. None of them mentioned accountability. None of them acknowledged the gravity of what happened. They spoke as if the situation was a PR inconvenience, not a violent act against a child. But outside their insulated bubble, something powerful was already in motion. Just before sunset, a vehicle unlike any typically seen in the neighborhood rolled up to the guarded gate. Dark, polished, unmarked, nothing flashy, but unmistakably official. The kind of vehicle that carried a presence heavier than authority. The guard saw it approach and felt his stomach twist. He recognized the type of government issue. He recognized purpose. The tactical commander stepped out. Not in uniform, not in gear, not in any display of intimidation. He didn't need to. His presence alone made the guard straighten, sweat forming at the edge of his collar. The man who once felt untouchable suddenly felt small. He realized the mask of authority the HOA gave him was nothing compared to the silent force standing in front of him now. Neighbors peeked from windows again, this time with curiosity rather than fear. They sensed a shift, like the ground beneath the HOA's control was starting to crack. The commander looked at the guard with an expression that held no emotion and yet spoke volumes. Calm, controlled, measured. The guard stammered excuses, tried to appear cooperative, but every word tripped over the next. His hands shook. His voice trembled. The false power he once relied on dissolved instantly. Behind the guard, the manicured neighborhood looked strangely artificial. The neatly trimmed lawns, the symmetrical houses, the pristine sidewalks. All of it now framed a tension that felt ready to snap. The commander didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He didn't gesture. He simply observed, cataloging details with the precision of someone who understood how to dismantle entire operations with evidence and procedure. He noticed the security booth camera, the weapon that should never have been issued, the badge the guard was never certified to wear, the logs left and signed, the inconsistencies everywhere. He had already seen the footage. He already knew the truth. Now he needed confirmation from the environment itself. And as he stood there, The neighborhood residents watched with silent anticipation, sensing that something monumental had begun. For the first time, fear shifted not toward the HOA, but away from it. The spell of control they had long cast over the community had begun to crack. The tactical commander stepped past the trembling guard and walked deeper into the neighborhood, toward the heart of the problem, toward the people who believed they were above consequences, toward the board that thought they could endanger a child without repercussions, toward the moment the entire HOA would finally face the fallout of their reckless authority. And as he walked, the atmosphere changed. A reckoning was coming, the kind no homeowners association was prepared for. The tactical commander's footsteps echoed through the spotless neighborhood streets, steady and unhurried. Every stride carried the weight of a man who understood exactly what he was walking into, and who he was walking toward. The quiet suburb, once a symbol of rigid HOA order, now felt like a stage awaiting the inevitable collision between false authority and real power. The evening sun cast long shadows across the uniform lawns, giving everything a golden stillness that belied the tension simmering beneath the surface. Residents lingered near windows and garages, quietly watching the man whose presence had already disrupted the fragile hierarchy of their community. They didn't know him, but they recognized something unmistakable. He was not someone easily intimidated, and certainly not someone who accepted injustice quietly. Inside one of the larger homes near the center of the neighborhood, the HOA board had convened in a state of growing panic. Papers were scattered across the dining table, laptops open to policy documents and insurance clauses. Their once confident expressions were strained, voices lowered but frantic as they strategized. They reviewed bylaws, debated excuses, and rehearsed narratives. They tried to cushion the severity of what had happened, framing it as a misunderstanding, an overreaction, a moment of heightened stress. But beneath their pretended calm, every board member felt the creeping realization that they might have pushed too far. They had long used power freely, fines, threats, intimidation, but this was different. This time, someone outside their control was involved. Someone with reach, training, and influence. Someone who would not fold under pressure or bureaucracy. Someone who had seen the footage of a gun pointed at his child. Their carefully constructed dominion over the neighborhood suddenly felt fragile. Yet they clung to their strategy. Deny, downplay, deflect. It had worked before. It had silenced residents, discouraged complaints, protected their authority. They expected it to work again. They didn't know the man walking toward them had already dismantled organizations far more formidable than a homeowners association. The commander approached the street where the board president lived. He scanned the property with the trained precision of someone cataloging a scene, security cameras, access points, vehicles, all assessed within seconds. He took in the manicured hedges, the perfectly aligned driveway pavers, the polished door hardware. Everything about the property conveyed arrogance, an obsession with order and control. Inside the house, the board president paced back and forth, trying to maintain the illusion of confidence. She was accustomed to being the most powerful person in the room, dictating rules, shaping narratives, bending compliance through fear of fines or violations. She believed the HOA was untouchable, protected by procedure and policy. She believed she was insulated. But as the tactical commander stepped onto her walkway, she felt the first tremor of fear tighten in her chest. Not because she feared him individually, but because she sensed the foundation of her authority shifting beneath her feet. The commander stopped outside the door for a moment, taking in the details, letting the weight of the situation settle. He had confronted cartel leaders, domestic extremists, and some of the most volatile individuals in the country. Yet nothing sharpened his focus more than seeing injustice inflicted on someone he loved. Inside, the board quickly tried to reorganize themselves, adjusting their posture, straightening documents, attempting to shape their image into something respectable and composed. They imagined they could control this the way they controlled everything else, through rules, through paperwork, through intimidation wrapped in professionalism. But the door opened before their performance fully settled. The immediate shift in atmosphere was palpable, even without words. The board members felt it the moment the commander stepped inside. He carried no aggression, no heated emotion, only a measured calm that was far more unsettling. Rage can be argued with. Emotion can be manipulated. Calm, controlled determination cannot. He surveyed the room, taking in every board member, assessing their reactions, their fear, their guilt. They attempted to present themselves as cooperative and authoritative, but nothing in their demeanor could disguise the reality beneath. He already knew precisely who had authorized the security guard's conduct. He already knew who issued the weapon illegally. He already knew who had trained their security staff to act as if they were law enforcement. He wasn't here to gather information. He was here to evaluate accountability. Across the community, neighbors continued to watch. Word spread quickly, through hushed exchanges, texts, whispers. They knew the HOA was meeting with someone important. They sensed the balance of power shifting. Many quietly hoped this was the moment the board finally faced consequences for the control they had exerted for years. The commander reviewed documents, policies, security protocols, each detail painting a clearer picture. The HOA had crossed legal boundaries repeatedly, operating as a self-made authority far beyond their jurisdiction. They had issued weapons without permits, authorized enforcement actions without training, and created a culture of fear disguised as neighborhood safety. The board's behavior was not merely unethical, it was dangerous. The board members' confidence eroded as the weight of their decisions became undeniable. Their explanations faltered. Their justifications thinned. Their claims of miscommunication dissolved under the scrutiny of someone who could see through every tactic. The home that once felt like the center of their power now felt suffocatingly small. Outside, a faint breeze moved through the neighborhood, rustling the identical hedges. Lights flicked on in living rooms as residents waited, sensed, hoped. Kids sat on porches with parents picking at the edges of their sneakers, wondering why the adults were whispering. The community was holding its breath as the meeting inside reached its silent climax. The HOA board realized the truth. They were no longer in control. The tactical commander didn't need to raise his voice or assert dominance. His presence alone dismantled the illusion of authority they had wielded for so long. He had all the evidence he needed. He knew every violation. He knew every overreach. He knew exactly how to proceed. And the board understood that the consequences coming would not be administrative, not minor, not something to negotiate away. This was no longer a neighborhood dispute. This was federal. As the commander exited the house and stepped back into the street, the last sliver of daylight faded behind the rooftops. The board watched with sinking hearts, realizing the reckoning they had tried so desperately to avoid was now inevitable. And for the first time in a long time, the community felt something unfamiliar. Relief. Because someone stronger than the HOA had finally stepped into the fight, the commander left the HOA president's house with the same steady, unhurried pace he had entered. But the impact of his visit continued to reverberate long after he stepped outside. The quiet neighborhood felt different now. Charged, tense, aware of an invisible shift in authority that no rulebook or HOA newsletter could camouflage. The residents sensed it, the board felt it, and the security guard who had initiated everything was beginning to understand the gravity of what he had done. Word traveled quickly, spilling through phone calls, group chats, and nervous whispers exchanged across driveways. Residents who had previously avoided calling out the HOA's overreach now allowed themselves to hope, carefully, cautiously, that the fear-soaked grip of their board was starting to crack. For the first time, they wondered what life might look like without threats masquerading as policy, without punishments disguised as community safety. But inside certain houses, the atmosphere was anything but hopeful. Panic settled like fog. The HOA board was unraveling. After the commander's exit, they remained seated around the table, staring at the documents spread before them. The weight of what had been exposed pressed into their thoughts like a tightening vice. Their secret weaponization of their so-called security team, their unauthorized tactical training, their unregistered firearms. They could no longer pretend these were minor infractions or simple misunderstandings. They understood federal implications. They understood criminal exposure. They understood that the man who had entered their home carried enough authority and jurisdiction to dismantle everything they had built. And worst of all, they understood that their power, the illusion they had carefully manufactured for years, was slipping away in real time. Across the neighborhood, Patrol cars began quietly circulating, not with sirens, not with lights, but with a deliberate and calculated presence. Local law enforcement had been notified, briefed, and instructed to secure the area. Officers took note of properties marked as HOA operations, assessing potential risks, logging evidence that would later be folded into a larger federal dossier. Residents stepped outside, pretending to water plants or retrieve mail, watching the patrols with wide eyes. It was a surreal reversal. The very people who had once felt powerless under the HOA now saw the oppressive board members becoming the ones monitored, scrutinized, and cornered. Meanwhile, the tactical commander moved methodically through his next steps. His priority remained unwavering, ensuring that the man who had pointed a gun at his son faced full accountability. He worked with the precision of someone accustomed to multi-layered operations, coordinating between agencies, verifying documentation, assembling reports, and extracting every detail from the footage he had gathered. The video remained the anchoring evidence, undeniable, uncut, unmanipulated. It showed every reckless movement of the guard's weapon, every violation of protocol, every display of unearned aggression. It wasn't simply enough to justify charges, it demanded them. Federal teams had begun assembling case files, preparing subpoenas, and cross-referencing complaints from residents who had long suffered under the board's authoritarian rule. What began as a single act of misconduct was rapidly expanding into a comprehensive investigation of the entire HOA. Misuse of funds, unauthorized enforcement actions, falsified violation records, and clandestine weapons training. The guard himself had retreated to his home, blinds shut, lights dimmed, pacing in tight circles. He replayed the moment over and over, the image of his own gun pointed at a teenager. His hands trembled at the memory he could not escape. He had believed he was acting as security, as authority, but now he understood that the role he had been given was never legitimate. He had been a pawn in the board's control tactics, and now he would pay the price for trusting their false power. As night settled over the neighborhood, a series of unmarked vehicles entered the community. They moved quietly with purpose. Their engines hummed low, their movements synchronized. A handful of residents watched from windows, barely breathing, as the vehicles parked at strategic points. Agents stepped out, calm, composed, anonymous in their professionalism. This was the moment where HOA influence ended and federal jurisdiction began. The board members were caught off guard when the knock came. Not aggressive, not frantic, just firm, final. Their expressions collapsed into dread as they opened the door and were met by badges that erased any remaining denial. The agents entered without resistance. The board knew they had no authority to challenge them. Their power meant nothing now. Inside the house, evidence was collected. Hard drives were copied. Documents were inspected. Hidden safes were located. Their private communications, once exchanged with confidence and entitlement, were now being reviewed through the lens of criminal investigation. Residents watched as board members were escorted out for questioning, faces drained of color, their posture deflated. For years they had walked these streets with superiority. Now they walked with the realization that their reign was over. Meanwhile, the commander stood near the entrance of the community, arms folded, observing the process from a distance. He did not need to intervene. He had ignited the chain reaction, and now it was unfolding with the precision he expected. His presence alone commanded respect, but he remained silent, allowing the agencies to execute their roles. Some residents approached cautiously, offering silent nods of gratitude. Others simply watched from afar, unsure how to process the sudden collapse of a system that had dominated their lives. But all felt the shift. All felt the relief of seeing justice take form. The turning point, however, was still ahead. The security guard, the man who had initiated the entire ordeal, was next. Agents approached his home, surrounded it, assessed the situation, and prepared for engagement. The guard, aware of what awaited him, sat on his couch with his head in his hands. There was no way out, no excuse strong enough, no policy vague enough to shield him. When the agents entered, he didn't flee, didn't resist. He understood. His fate had been sealed the instant he raised that weapon. His arrest wasn't the end of the case. It was the beginning of the final unraveling. Back at the entrance, the commander watched the guard being escorted out, hands secured, eyes downcast. There was no triumph in the commander's expression, only the steady resolve of a man who had fulfilled his duty. His son had been threatened, and justice had been delivered. But the investigation was far from finished. This community had deeper problems than one reckless guard, and the next stage would expose every one of them. The neighborhood felt different the next morning, as if the air itself had been waiting for a long overdue shift. For years, the community had lived under an invisible pressure, an atmosphere shaped by constant surveillance, excessive fines, and the ever-present threat of retaliation from the HOA board. Now, after a single night of federal intervention, that pressure had broken. Silence hung over the streets, but it wasn't the fearful quiet that once defined the neighborhood. It was the silence that follows a storm, the kind that leaves everything washed clean. Residents emerged slowly from their homes, blinking into the soft morning light as if adjusting to a new reality. Patrol cars were still present, but their presence brought reassurance rather than anxiety. Agents moved with calm purpose, securing evidence, reviewing recorded statements, and cataloging materials that would later support a series of charges. The HOA board members had been transported to separate locations for extended questioning, leaving their once formidable headquarters, an over-renovated clubhouse, dark and locked. The collapse of their authority was complete. The commander stood at the edge of the neighborhood, surveying the unfolding aftermath with the same composed expression he had worn since the investigation began. The boy who had experienced fear on what should have been a simple walk home now stood nearby, watching the activity with quiet curiosity. He was safe, unharmed, protected by the full weight of his father's determination and the justice system's response. The commander observed him for a moment, absorbing the unspoken reassurance in seeing him secure and steady. The threat had been real, but so was the outcome. The danger was gone, and the ones responsible were being held accountable. Throughout the day, the community began to change in visible ways. Neighbors who once avoided speaking to one another now gathered in small groups, exchanging relieved glances and tentative conversations. Stories emerged, accounts of past intimidation, unjust fines, and coercive tactics that had remained buried out of fear. Now those stories had space to breathe, and those who had suffered felt a renewed sense of unity. Some residents removed the HOA notices that had been taped to their doors for months. Others rolled their trash bins out without worrying about exact placement. A few swept their driveways slowly, taking in the rare feeling of peace. Children played in the cul-de-sac again, no longer worried about being reprimanded for stepping on decorative gravel or riding their bikes too fast. The transformation wasn't just physical, it was emotional. The community was reclaiming itself. By late afternoon, a formal announcement was made. The HOA was dissolved pending criminal investigation. Until further notice, federal oversight and local authorities would jointly manage any necessary administrative tasks. The clubhouse would remain closed. The previous board members were barred from any decision-making role within the neighborhood. The residents gathered near the clubhouse steps to hear the update. They listened in stunned silence, their expressions shifting from disbelief to relief. Some lowered their heads, overwhelmed by the realization that the tyranny they had accepted as normal was finally over. Others allowed themselves small smiles, savoring the reality that things could move forward differently now. The commander watched the gathering from a distance, allowing the residents to experience their moment of collective release. He didn't need recognition or gratitude. His role had never been about praise. It had been about justice, and that mission was complete. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the quiet streets, he prepared to leave the neighborhood. His job there was done, and his son's safety was restored. But before he stepped away, he allowed himself one last look at the community. The houses stood the same as before, neatly spaced, carefully painted, familiar in layout. But something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface. The people were no longer controlled. The fear was gone. The neighborhood felt lighter, freer, more human than it had in years. And though the commander walked away with a calm, measured stride, the community would remember him as the force that ended the reign of an HOA that had believed itself untouchable. Justice had come to their streets, not with chaos, but with quiet, unstoppable precision. And from that day on, the HOA's power was nothing more than a memory of a failed regime.